It's time to build the ultimate gaming PC build for 2021, featuring this, the new RTX 3080 Ti. In today's video, I'm going to run you through all the parts I opted for in this insane PC build. I'm going to put the system together from start right through to finish before booting it up and testing it out in some of the biggest titles out there. Let's do this. As usual, let's kick things off with the CPU and the motherboard. This right here is AMD's Ryzen 9 5900X. This CPU is one of the most bonkers processors I think I've ever used. It only falls short just about to its own 5950X bigger brother, and it's one of the most just insane chips you can buy for streaming, for editing, for gaming, and it's also crucially going to make sure the 3080 Ti is not bottlenecked. The last thing you want to do is buy a nice high-end GPU and it be bottlenecked by the CPU, because it's just a big waste of money otherwise, isn't it? I'm going to be installing it into an X570 motherboard. Now, as many of you will know, I'm a big fan of B550, but when you're spending this much money, a decent motherboard is always worth the bit of extra cash. Now, you can read our full review of the X570 AORUS Master over on the website. There's plenty of content on there and lots more to come very soon. We might even be hiring a dedicated writer for the website, so exciting times ahead on that front. Now, this is a pretty awesome motherboard in my opinion, with plenty of VRM cooling for good overclocking, 4 RAM DIMM slots, loads of Gen 4 PCIe slots, and plenty of connectivity with a built-in I/O shield that actually includes Wi-Fi and some gold audio connectors. How baller is that? This is going to be an awesome board for a build like this. In order to install the CPU, you want to line up the golden triangle on the bottom left of the processor with the triangle on the top left of the CPU socket. Simply pull up the retention arm, drop the chip in, and pop the arm back down. Nice and simple. I'm going to be pairing this up with some RAM from Corsair. This is a 32GB kit of their Vengeance RGB Pro in white. Now, the white colour scheme might sound a little bit confusing, considering, of course, we have gone for a pretty black and grey motherboard, but you'll see why a little bit later in today's video. All we need to do to install it is simply line up the notch on the memory with the little silver notches on our RAM DIMM slots. We're going to use the second and fourth slots along to give us a juicy dual channel performance bonus, and they just slot into place really nice and easily, a little something like this. The final part then we're going to install on the motherboard is the M.2 SSD, and this is actually very, very important. That's because the system we're building today has so much power with the 3080 Ti that we need to make sure storage doesn't become a bottleneck. This is Seagate's Firecuda 520. It's a Gen 4 NVMe drive that delivers speeds in the region of about 5 gigabytes per second, which is pretty crazy. You get Seagate's data recovery included as standard as well, which is always reassuring to have for a bit of peace of mind. I'm going to be installing it in the top slot here. This drive actually doesn't technically need a heatsink. It will appreciate one if you give it, but it won't overheat, it won't thermal throttle without one, which is always a nice bonus, as some Gen 4 M.2 drives get incredibly toasty, like fire incredibly toasty. Once the motherboard assembly then is nice and complete, we can go ahead and move this into the case for this build. And to do that, I need to move out of the way our fancy CPU cooler, more on that shortly, our fancy power supply, more on that shortly as well, to get our Corsair iCUE, oh my goodness me, iCUE 5000X RGB. Now, I love this case. It's one of Corsair's recently released chassis on their 5000 series lineup. You can get a non-RGB kind of airflowy version, but this one has a cool glass panel, and we actually built a full custom loop water-cooled build in this case, so let's just say we've got memories together. You can find that video in the cards section now. Let's go ahead though and take it out of the box, a little something like this, and there we go. That was nice and simple, wasn't it? This is an awesome case though. It's got a full glass panel at the front with 3 RGB fans included behind it. You've got glass at the top with actually a decent bit of airflow clearance as well. And then around the back, you've got, you guessed it, even more glass, but even more airflow as well. Corsair have managed to strike a really nice balance here. And if someone moans about the airflow of this case, just buy the airflow version. It's really not that complicated. I think we have too many cases nowadays that are just obsessed with mesh everywhere. And I think sometimes it's important to try and strike, that looks ominous, try and strike a little bit of a balance. Now, in order to get the motherboard installed into the case, we need to strip off as many side panels as we can. So for us, we're going to take the top and both the side panels off as well. And then it's a simple case of spinning the motherboard round, locating the 9 standoff holes, 3 at the top, 3 in the middle, and 3 along the bottom, and matching these up with the corresponding black standoffs in the case. These are super easy to spot, actually, because we've got a white case, we've got black standoffs, and this is also where the white memory comes in. So let's go ahead and literally, it's really as simple as this. Slide the motherboard in, try and align it over the standoffs. Can be a little bit fiddly, but there we have it. And then it's a simple case of fastening it down with the included screws, and we're good to go, ready to move on to the next component today, the CPU cooler. Exciting, but easily the most difficult bit of any build. So there's that. Speaking of which, this is it. This is the Corsair H150i Elite Capellix. Now, that sounds very complicated, but it's pretty simple. You've got RGB fans as standard, hence the iCUE bit, and the Elite Capellix means you've got Corsair's bright Capellix RGBs. You'll see when we actually boot the system up how bright some of the fans and the water blocks are. And this 360mm rad can be positioned in a number of different places in the case, actually. It could either go at the front, or it could go at the back here once we remove this panel, but I'm thinking it might make more sense to go at the top of the case. That will give us some extra exhaust, and while it's perhaps not optimal placement for the pump, it doesn't really matter long term, and if you'd prefer a front mounted option, you're going to have clearance and room to do that as well. I think the top will work well though, especially if we can put some extra fans on here to really illuminate through the glass panels. So let's go for that. This is available in black or white, but I have of course gone for the white version, as I think that will just tie in that little bit better overall with the build colour scheme. Now, installing this onto the motherboard is actually really easy. You'll see here that we've actually got this cool little D bracket and a thumb screw. This is going to directly clip over the plastic mounting hardware that's installed by default onto the motherboard. Essentially, what it means is you haven't got to add in an extra backplate, you haven't got to do any fancy assembly, these just clip over the top, and the radiator screws into the top of the case. Let's get the radiator in first and round off with the water block afterwards. You know what? That's really starting to come together. I feel like I say that all the time, but it is a pretty good looking system, I reckon. Now that brings us nicely on to the next component today, the GPU. I've got to give a huge shout out to Gigabyte and Nvidia for helping to make this portion of today's video possible, sending out the new RTX 3080Ti for me to not only look at, but use in the build. This is a really awesome card if you're looking to play gaming at basically the upper echelons of performance. If you want RTX 3090 performance without the price tag that goes with it, this is the card for you. 4K gaming, 60, 80, 100 frames per second? Absolutely. Ray tracing? Absolutely. DLSS? Absolutely. Basically, this is the card that covers all of the bases. If you want to do some video editing or become a streamer and you want to use all those CUDA cores for rendering, this is the card for you. If you're looking to save a bit of cash, something like a 3070 Ti or even a 3060 Ti is where I'd point my money for a 1080 or 1440p oriented system. Games like Cyberpunk 2077, the latest Call of Duty Warzone update, Watch Dogs Legion and Control are all going to work amazingly well on this card. With plenty of video memory and some really impressive specs, you can read our full 3080 Ti review over on the website, in the cards now, or in the description below. Let's go ahead though and get this Gigabyte Eagle card unboxed and see what Gigabyte have done with that Nvidia 3080 Ti design. Straight off the bat then, looking pretty good. We've got 3 fans on here, a kind of design that actually slims out a little bit nearer our PCIe lanes, probably for sort of GPU clearance on cases and stuff. We also have a nice backplate design as well, with this kind of extension area. You can see where Gigabyte have added a bit more heatsink to really beef the card up and give it that slightly better cooling. This is one of the more affordable SKUs in the 3080 Ti range, which allows you to get that 3080 Ti performance without breaking the bank, of course stock and availability depending. Let's go ahead though and install the GPU into the build, and we'll take a deeper dive at the performance with ray tracing and DLSS and all that good stuff a little bit later on. There we go, fits really well actually. Plenty of breathing room, but it doesn't look too small or out of place in the case, and it brings us on nicely to the final component today, which is of course the power supply. Now this right here is Corsair's RM850X, but in white. It's got some white braided cables which will look awesome and help to tie in with the whole build colour scheme today. This video isn't going to be sort of a full build guide, but we did publish one of those recently, which you can find in the card section now, so we will time lapse the next bit. But essentially we've just got the GPU, motherboard and CPU to connect up before we finally boot the system up to see how well it performs. But first, how good it looks when it's all powered up with those Capellix RGBs in an epic glam montage. I'll see you in a sec, but first, roll that montage. Awesome stuff. So the system looks great when it's all powered up. That white Corsair 5000 series case, plenty of RGB, and the behemoth 3080Ti. But how exactly does it perform? Well, on your screen now is a summary, a snapshot view of all the different gaming benchmarks that we actually tested on this PC. If you'd like to check out the full unedited gaming benchmark runs for the 3080Ti, they'll be on our benchmarking YouTube channel linked below. For now though, let's take a closer look at some of the titles, kicking things off with Fortnite. At 1080p competitive settings, we got a staggering 392 FPS on average, nearly 400 frames per second at 1080p with everything tuned down to low, the render distance set to far, and the most competitive settings layout. Call of Duty's Warzone is next up, and here at 4K high settings with Nvidia's DLSS tech enabled, we got an impressive 132 frames per second on average, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results, which never really saw the game drop below 90 frames a second, even at 4K. Now that is crazy. Apex Legends is next, and it was once again a really positive story. At 4K high settings, we got 117 frames per second, with 102 and 92 FPS for the 90 and 99th percentile results. Moving on to Cyberpunk, here at 4K medium settings with ray tracing and DLSS on, we got just over 50 frames per second on average. Cyberpunk is of course the most difficult game to run on the market right now, especially when you tune those ray tracing settings up and play at the full 4K resolution. Visually though, the game looked great, there was no real lag, stuttering or screen tearing, it was super playable, and visually it looked fantastic. Next up is Watch Dogs Legion. This is another one of our ray tracing titles today, and here at 4K high settings with ray tracing and DLSS enabled, we got an impressive 70 FPS on average when we use the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode. Now you could get this even higher if you drop down to 1440p, and part of the reason it is so good is because of that DLSS tech. DLSS is an AI-backed resolution scaler that helps to render the game out at a slightly low resolution and uses AI to upscale it, giving you the FPS advantage of say 1440p at 4K. Pretty cool stuff. GTA 5 is next up, and while it's not a ray tracing or DLSS or even a new title for that fact, it is a great test. We use it on all of our systems because it's easily comparable to what you guys might be rocking already at home. Here at 1440p high settings, we got 184 frames per second on average. 184 FPS. Pretty crazy. The game obviously looked great. I wouldn't expect anything less from a Ryzen 9 and an RTX 3080 system. Finally then, Valorant is the last game today, and here, if you want a bit of frame rate, Valorant can deliver it to you. At 4K high settings, we got 433 frames per second. 433 FPS on average. That is absolutely crazy, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results. That pretty much wraps it up though for the whole video. If you enjoyed today's video, give it a big old like rating, make sure to get subscribed. Thank you for watching though, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.